Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven. Michael Walker is not very well today, so I'm standing in. And I'm joined tonight by the one, the only, and I'm going to say it, Ash, the iconic Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
You know what? I'm doing a lot better than Michael, who is recovering very well after that ball-bearing accident that you so cunningly manufactured.
Not guilty, Ash, I swear. Coming up later in the show, Netanyahu said that he's willing to accept a partial deal with Hamas. Nigel Farage has attacked the Daily Mail. But first, we'll be looking at the slow-motion car crash that is the Tory party election campaign. Just when you thought this election couldn't get any worse for the Tories, it has. It emerged this weekend that the party's chief data scientist is under investigation by the Gambling Commission for potentially illegal betting. Nick Mason is alleged to have placed dozens of bets on the date of the election in the days before Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced it. According to reports, his combined winnings would have amounted to thousands of pounds. He joins husband and wife team Tony Lee and Laura Saunders in the gambling regulator's sights. Lee is the party's director of campaigning, while Saunders is the Tory candidate for North West Bristol. Both are now under investigation. Tory MP and Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, Craig Williams, is also being investigated after he admitted placing a £100 bet on the election date just 3 days before Sunak's announcement. Also under investigation is a Met police officer who was part of Sunak's close protection team. The officer was arrested and then bailed last week. Now, Lee and Mason, who don't hold elected roles, have both taken a leave of absence from the party's headquarters. But Williams and Saunders are still standing as candidates in their respective constituencies. And none of the 4 Tories implicated in the scandal have been suspended by the party, not even Williams, who described his bet as, quote, a huge error of judgment. Understandably, Sunak's failure to take decisive action while the Tory party once again appears to be the party of sleaze has left some Conservative candidates fuming. One Tory candidate told the newspaper this about Sunak's failure to suspend those under investigation. There are no excuses for this at all. If the PM wants to show some leadership and credibility, then it should just be done. That candidate went on to say that Sunak's failure to act was, quote, due to him having no backbone and protecting his mates. Isn't that just the Tory way? A former Tory minister standing for re-election was more pithy, calling the shambles, quote, a fucking disgrace. And asked about whether Sunak should suspend those potentially involved in bet rigging, former Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood told the BBC this.
Should the Prime Minister have suspended the 2 Conservative candidates?
Well, given the scale of this as we see now and the potential for this story to continue to eclipse, to overshadow the election, I would now agree. I'm not sure anyone, including the Prime Minister, could have predicted the number of people involved when this story first broke. The public want to see clear, robust action now. The practical dilemma you face, though, is were individuals responding to the whirlwind of the rumour mill around Westminster at the time, and I remember that very vividly, about a pending election announcement, or were they in the room when the decision was made? If it was the latter, the party can take immediate action.
So why hasn't Sunak acted to get on top of the scandal? Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris was asked that question on Sky News.
Why not suspend them in the meantime while the investigation's going on?
Firstly, I mean, I don't know if they did have any knowledge at the time they made the bet.
Yeah, I know you don't, but one of the candidates said, I did it, the Gambling Commission will investigate.
Yeah, and this is for the Gambling Commission to investigate. When the Gambling Commission report back, as the Prime Minister said, if people are found guilty of doing something that is incorrect, then they'll be kicked out of the party.
Yeah, but why not suspend them in the meantime? Then because that's actually happened. A couple of your officials, not candidates, but officials have taken a leave of absence, and the police officer accused of doing this has been suspended. So why is it a different rule for Conservative Party electoral candidates?
When there was a police investigation going on into Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner for different things over the course of the last 2 years, they maintained their role. Is that
the same?
It's very, very similar.
They didn't admit doing anything wrong, and they were proved correct.
Yeah, and that's what an investigation is about, isn't it? That's what the Gambling Commission will determine.
Yes, but the difference here is one of the candidates have said, I placed the bet, haven't they? your candidate, well, I'm not going to say where the constituency is, but in Wales.
Yeah. Well, and the Gambling Commission...
suspend him in the meantime.
The Gambling Commission are looking into that, and we will act on what the Gambling Commission say.
Now, there's a very important difference between this case and the Angela Rayner story. Rayner's investigation came about after multi-millionaire and former Tory deputy chairman Michael Ashcroft made an allegation about her tax affairs in one of his many trashy political books. That was then picked up by the right-wing press, who hounded Labour's deputy leader in an obvious and concerted smear campaign. In the end, Rayner was completely cleared by both the police and HMRC. In the Bain case, however, it's the Independent Gambling Commission that's come knocking on the doors of the top Tories in question. And as a Sky journalist said, at least one of them has already admitted to placing a bet. Sunak's gambling headache may soon get even worse, if you can imagine it. It's being reported that the Gambling Commission is looking into up to 10 people who may have had first-hand knowledge of the election date. And they're also compiling a second list, numbering dozens of people who placed bets and are associates or contacts of the first group. The situation is so bad that the actual Prime Minister had to deny his own involvement in the betting scandal to reporters in Edinburgh today. But he also said this.
Well, it's important to remember that the Gambling Commission investigations are independent. I don't have the details of those. They don't obviously report to me. But what I can tell you is we have been in parallel conducting our own internal inquiries and will, of course, act on any relevant findings or information.
It's more than just a little awkward to have ministers telling the media they'll have to wait for the outcome of the Gambling Commission's investigations, only for the Prime Minister to say the party's been doing their own one all along. Ash, this gambling scandal has really escalated over the weekend. Do you think it's going to cut through with voters?
It's really hard sometimes when you work in media to tell what's going to cut through, because what you're talking about the most isn't necessarily what people are thinking about the most. So just a concrete example of that. Earlier on in the election, when Labour candidate selection was a very big story, a lot of focus particularly on what was going to happen with Diane Abbott. Was she going to have the whip restored? Was she going to be able to stand as a Labour candidate? When that was dominating the news and also dominating Novara media headlines, the thing that was cutting through to people was still the national service story. So these things may also work on a bit of a delay when you don't necessarily have an electorate which is full of people who are really, really, really highly engaged with political media. You know, I don't know, maybe they're psychologically healthy or something. Could never be me. So I wonder if this one might act on a bit of a delay. And if the scandal rumbles on, then it will have that kind of cut through. But I think it definitely adds to the mood music of this is a party who are all in it for themselves, who look at every moment of political change as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than doing something for the country, and also a certain degree of arrogance, because anyone who is in the least bit familiar with betting, particularly if you're into sports, you know that if you work in the industry that you're betting on, I don't know how, but the betting industry seems to know and is very active in identifying individuals who may have some of that insider knowledge and cracking down on it, because the betting companies don't want to pay out, particularly when, you know, there were long odds on something. So if they can work out when a Premier League footballer has enlisted a network of friends and family to place bets for him, they're going to find out that you know, senior figure in CCHQ or police officer who works as a close protection officer for Rishi Sunak counts as someone who's going to have insider knowledge, because these are all individuals who, for other kinds of financial transactions, would be flagged up by the system as politically exposed persons. So really, even Burglar Bill could work out that this was not a scam that you'd want to try and pull off, that you'd get caught immediately. But these guys were just so arrogant and so clueless. It seemed to never even occur to them.
Yeah, the arrogance is pretty breathtaking. And I wonder about the cut through, though, because I think like it has a familiar pattern that we've seen before with the Tories, one that takes us back to just the post-COVID period. And that's something that we're going to come on to now, because there's no doubt many Tories are furious with the party leadership. Olympic gold medalist James Cracknell is standing for the Conservatives in Colchester. Now, We don't know exactly why he posted this video on Facebook, but it came on the weekend dominated by Tory betting scandal headlines.
2 weeks out from the Olympics, and if we are competing against the Conservative Party, my teammates and I would be saying they are a shower of shit. And if one of my teammates got caught for cheating, they'd be dead to me. That abuse of trust is unforgivable. So why am I still canvassing and delivering leaflets? Because I believe the Conservative way is the best for the country. Freedom to succeed, protection of our national security, and personal responsibility.
Now, personal responsibility was a topic that Boris Johnson also liked to bang on about at the height of the COVID pandemic, but somehow he wasn't really a fan of the idea just a few years later. And Johnson's downfall was brought up by one Tory minister who seems to have taken the opportunity to stick the knife in. Speaking to The Times, Levelling Up Minister Michael Gove said this about Rishi Sunak's handling of Gamblegate. It looks like one rule for them and one rule for us. That's the most potentially damaging thing. The perception that we operate outside the rules that we set for others. That was damaging at the time of Partygate, and it's damaging here. Now, that looks a lot like Gove painting Sunak with a Boris Johnson brush. And that message soon caught on. This is Chris Heaton-Harris again, this time on GMB.
It feels like it's one rule for Conservative Party members and another rule for the others. We've been here before. We've been here before with Partygate. Michael Gove is right, isn't he? Michael Gove is absolutely right. This feels like, yet again, another Partygate. And I think Partygate was when the public turned in a huge way against his government. And in a time of election, when you're supposed to be proving your integrity and honour, this is happening. It's a disgrace.
So I would much rather be talking about Conservative Party policy, how we're going to govern for the coming 5 years, how we're going to increase checks on immigration to make sure we lower immigration figures, how we're going to lower taxes, comparing that to what Labour are promising, which is obviously higher taxes, more immigration, a politically correct education system.
When your political career dies, you don't hear angel singings, you hear Good Morning Britain hosts cackling off camera. Gove's comment led an anonymous Tory source to call him, quote, a fucking traitor in the newspaper. Very salty language from these Tories this weekend. Ash, Gove is one of 80 Tories not running for re-election. What do you make of his comments on this?
Okay, so the first thing is that Michael Gove is someone who I've got very serious political and moral disagreements with, but there's one thing that you can't accuse him of, and that's being stupid when perhaps it comes to matters of self-interest. He knew that this election was not going to be a good look for the Tories, and I think he also suspected that his seat wouldn't be safe enough for comfort. So he was like, F this, I'm out. The benefit of having experienced media performers like Gove or like Chris Heaton-Harris, who are on their way out, who aren't standing as MPs for this election, is that they both get to speak on behalf of the Conservative Party and run defence, but also at the same time they can say, well, I'm not standing, I'm not party to these discussions, and put distance between the defence of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party as an institution, which people widely perceive and rightly perceive as being totally rotten. So that's the reason why Michael Gove and Chris Heaton-Harris are being wheeled out for this particular purpose. It's because they can claim outsider status when it benefits them, but also have enough of the insider status to be able to speak for the party. Now, is that going to be enough to neutralise this particular story? Absolutely not. It's the sort of last-ditch attempt of a desperate party who, don't forget, last week we were briefing that they were going to get Boris Johnson back out on the campaign trail. This is the same Boris Johnson who they knifed in the back. So I think that CCHQ are definitely running out of ideas, and this was a bit of a Hail Mary and not a particularly successful one.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears to have backed away from a ceasefire deal with Hamas. Speaking on Israel's Channel 14 on Sunday, Netanyahu said this.
If there is an agreement, it will be an agreement according to our terms, and our terms are not to end the war, to leave Gaza and leave Hamas as it is. I refuse to leave Hamas as it is. We need to eliminate it.
The deal currently on the table is one that gradually builds to a permanent ceasefire through 3 phases. It was proposed by the US, who've always insisted that it was penned by Israeli officials, despite comments to the contrary from Israeli politicians. Netanyahu's remarks make that claim by Washington appear less plausible than ever. In response, Hamas has said this: "It is now clear to the world that Netanyahu is the one rejecting and obstructing the deal proposed in the Biden speech and the latest UN Security Council resolution, not Hamas." In that same interview, Netanyahu went on to outline his post-war plans for the Palestinian territories.
In the end, you will have to do two things. You will need the ongoing military demilitarization by the Israel Defense Forces, and you will need to establish a civil administration, I hope with the support and management of certain countries in the region. I think this is the right way to move forward. I'll tell you what I'm not ready to do. I'm not ready to establish a Palestinian state there. I'm not ready to hand it over to the Palestinian Authority. I'm not ready to do that.
Netanyahu has always said he wants the IDF to secure military control over the Strip as a matter of Israel's national security. But in the 8 months that Gaza has been under various phases of Israeli military control, over 37,000 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 15,000 of that number were children. And in the occupied West Bank, which is not Hamas-run and where Palestinians have some level of self-governance, civilians are still accustomed to brutal and often deadly treatment by IDF soldiers. Footage has recently emerged from the city of Jenin, showing an IDF jeep driving through the streets of the city with an injured Palestinian man strapped to its bonnet. The man, Mujahed Azmi, says he was shot in the hand and leg by soldiers. His parents asked the soldiers to call an ambulance, but instead they strapped him to their vehicle, appearing to use the injured man as a human shield. The Israeli military said that the conduct of the forces in the video does not conform to the values of the IDF, and that the incident would be investigated. Statements that I think we've already heard many, many times before. Ash, what do you think Netanyahu's endgame here is? I mean, is there one, or is it just chaos?
Well, I think that chaotic circumstances ultimately benefit Netanyahu more. It's really difficult to tell what his long-term plan is when his short to medium-term prospects look so volatile. He's not confident that if the war ended tomorrow, that his political career would survive it. And that's because, one, he's been trying to push through these changes to Israel's Supreme Court. This was before October 7th. It led to mass protests against Netanyahu and his government, carried out by the Israeli population, of course. And secondly, there are the security failures for October 7th and the failures to retrieve the hostages alive through a ceasefire deal, which at some point he's going to have to answer for. Now, as we have discussed on this show and Novara Media more generally many times, Netanyahu is not the cause of the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza, by which I mean it's not like if you remove him, the expansionist ambitions of Israel, the continuation of ethnic cleansing and displacement and conditions of apartheid, human rights abuses, indefinite detention, torture, and mass killing, all these things would continue. What would change is how and at what intensity and at what frequency in terms of intervals of like, oh, we're really trying to maintain a peace process. That's all that would change, is the timing of these things, not whether or not they happen. The mainstream position in Israeli politics is essentially indefinite occupation. That's what it is. So getting rid of Netanyahu wouldn't be a solution to those things. His short to medium term prospects aren't stable. So the more chaotic the circumstances and the more he can drag the war on, the better for him and his career. Now, when it comes to the horrific video that you just showed of a Palestinian man in Jenin being strapped to the front of an Israeli military vehicle and essentially paraded through the streets, I mean, it's funny how this keeps happening, right? It's funny how there are all of these isolated incidents of people wearing the uniform of the Israeli Defense Forces abusing Palestinian civilians, whether that's shooting dead Palestinian civilians who are waving white flags or rummaging through the underwear drawers of Gazan women, or desecrating mosques, or desecrating people's Qurans in homes that the military have occupied, or whether it's setting up a torture camp in the middle of the desert. It's funny how all these things, which are completely against the values of the IDF, keep on happening. I really hope that they launch an investigation to get to the bottom of that, Stephen, because it's puzzling me.
Yeah, it's puzzling me too. Actually, I wanted to ask you another question about the domestic situation in Israel. So obviously, there's the war going on in Gaza, increasing tensions in the north with the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah has essentially created a buffer zone between Lebanon and Israel by forcing the evacuation of much of the northern parts of the country. And then there's also increasing hostilities in the West Bank, or increasing occupation of the West Bank is actually a better way of putting it, increasing militarization of the West Bank. Can Israel really fight a war on three fronts at the same time against a now quite damaged civilian population in Gaza, a much less damaged civilian population in the West Bank, and a very well-armed force in southern Lebanon?
I mean, this is the thing, is that when it comes to the paradigm of Israeli politics, it really is based on delusion. It is based on the delusion that what you can do is have an incredibly belligerent and militarized state in the middle of the Middle East, surrounded on three sides by Arab countries, which espouses a policy of Jewish supremacy and has not respected the territorial integrity or sovereignty of its neighbors, and that's just going to go fine, and that's not going to endanger your own civilians, as well as, of course, wreaking havoc on the lives of Palestinians and Israel's other neighbors as well. I mean, that's a completely delusional position. Now, this isn't a delusion which has come out of nowhere. It's a delusion which is bolstered by the billions and billions of dollars of military aid handed over every year by the United States of America. It's a delusion which is bolstered by the activities of Western states in diplomatic circles. And it's a delusion which is reinforced by Israeli media and politics, this idea that you can fight a war on multiple fronts, that you can create the conditions which make a militant group like Hamas entirely inevitable, and yet your civilians are going to enjoy safety in Israel more than they could in the United States or Britain or in Germany or wherever. You spell it out like that and you go, that's just nonsense. It's complete nonsense.
Nigel Farage has had possibly the most successful campaign of this election. He's had plenty of media coverage, large crowds of fans wherever he goes, and a pretty easy time from journalists. But then he went a step too far, whipping the media and political classes into a frenzy of outrage. So were they angry at his promise of cruelty to immigrants? Or perhaps it was his enthusiasm for a completely unchecked free market? Or maybe they hated his pledge to privatize the NHS. Of course not. Instead, it was these comments made on BBC's Panorama.
When Vladimir Putin sent his troops across the border in 22, you blamed the West, not him. You said, I'll just read it to you and then you can react, that on a tweet, it was a consequence of EU and NATO expansion. Is that a judgment you stand by?
Right. I'll tell you what, you don't know. I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
Sorry.
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. Of course it's his fault. He's used what
But we provoked the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism.
Those comments by Farage led to a pretty extraordinary backlash.
What he said was completely wrong and only plays into Putin's hands. This is a man who deployed nerve agents on the streets of Britain.
Farage's comments about Russia and Ukraine are disgraceful. I've always been clear that Putin bears responsibility, sole responsibility, for the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And we have always stood behind Ukraine and supported Ukraine. And so far, we've done it united across Parliament. I've made it my business to ensure that the opposition stood with the government on this issue. So seriously did we take it. And of course, with our NATO allies. And I think anybody who wants to stand to be a representative in our Parliament should be really clear that whether it's Russian aggression on the battlefield or online, that we stand against that aggression. That's, standing behind Ukraine, but also standing up for our freedom.
But for a man who always claims to speak like Winston Churchill, he sounds an awful lot more like Neville Chamberlain to me. I mean, this, frankly, is appeasement. He's repeating the Kremlin's propaganda lines. And during the Cold War, we had a word for people like that. We called them useful idiots. And it sounds to me like Nigel Farage is just being Putin's poodle on this.
But Farage doubled down, writing this column for The Telegraph. The West's errors in Ukraine have been catastrophic. I won't apologise for telling the truth. Until we admit what we got wrong, we will never have a lasting peace. In that column, Farage accused the West of, quote, poking the bear through eastward EU and NATO expansion. But he also decried Putin's invasion of Ukraine, saying he was not an appeaser and had never sought to justify Putin's attack on the country. And Farage went on to say this. There is no easy solution to the war, but facing up to the truth about the causes and consequences must be a start. That's why I simply want to tell it as it is and have done for a decade. Those slanderers who claim that telling the truth makes me a mouthpiece for Putin only reveal the weakness of their own case. There is an issue of British democracy here too. The escalation of British support for the war in Ukraine has not even been an issue in this election campaign, since the old parties all agree with it. Am I, as the leader of Reform UK, a party that is now running second in major polls, not even allowed to question this political conformism? The answer to that question, apparently, was no. This was former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's take on Farage's article. This is nauseating ahistorical drivel and more Kremlin propaganda. Nobody provoked Putin. Nobody poked the bear with a stick. The people of Ukraine voted overwhelmingly in 1991 to be a sovereign and independent country. They were perfectly entitled to seek both NATO and EU membership. There is only one person responsible for Russian aggression against Ukraine, both in 2014 and 2022, and that is Putin. To try to spread the blame is morally repugnant and parroting Putin's lies. It is bizarre that the author should also suggest we now reduce our support for Ukraine, when the solution to the conflict is in fact clear. The Ukrainians need to win and to repel Putin's invasion. They can and they will. The problem in the last 30 years has not been Western provocation, but Western weakness in the face of Russian aggression, a weakness exemplified by this article. On the campaign trail, Farage clapped back at Johnson.
Let's have a little look at guys, shall we? Here is Boris Johnson. Daily Mail, are you watching? Here is Boris Johnson from 2016. This is what Boris said. Boris blames the European Union for war in Ukraine. The former mayor is called a Putin apologist after challenging Brussels expansionism. Well, perhaps it's Boris Johnson that's morally repugnant and not me. I don't know.
I think that's what Freud calls the narcissism of small differences. And I really think printing that front page out so big was worth the costs. Now, Farage mentions the Daily Mail in that clip. That's because his comments also prompted comments from the office of Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, splashed across the Mail on Sunday's front page. It said this: Zelensky, Farage is infected with virus of Putin. Farage responded by attacking the Mail group and saying the story was only published in an effort to stop Reform UK from entering Parliament. He also said he had instructed his lawyers to take legal action against the Mail. Ash, let's start with Farage's potentially dangerous rebuke of the Mail. Are the right-wing establishment media really trying to halt Reform UK?
Well, the thing is, it's wrong at this moment in time to think of right-wing establishment media as being coherent around one political strategy or one figure. Because obviously, the Conservative Party has, how do I put this not crudely, but just like royally shat itself and is in a state of crisis. And there's no telling who's going to be left as an MP in the party after July the 4th, let alone who's going to be the next leader. There is a real sense of going, of panic, of going, who's going to take leadership of the Conservative Party? And more than that, who's going to take leadership in terms of setting the agenda for British conservatism? All of that is up for grabs. Now, Nigel Farage has worked out that trying to distance himself from the Conservative Party and what he, calls the conservative establishment is only a good thing. It's only a good thing for him. It means that he's not really seen as an extension of the Conservative Party. Really, that's how UKIP operated in many ways. So first being antagonistic, taking votes away from the Conservative Party and then flooding the Conservative Party with its members. He's saying, no, I want nothing to do with you. So if you're a newspaper like the Daily Mail or you're the Telegraph, less so the Times, that they pride themselves on being a more moderate voice of British conservatism, although that's still pretty batshit. You don't really know what to do. Do you circle the wagons around the Conservative Party, or do you try and piggyback on Nigel Farage, even though you don't really know where he's going to go with it? And so I think that's what this conflict demonstrates, although we will get to the meat and potatoes of what he actually said in just a second.
It's also striking that the Tories and Labour, as well as the right-wing and the centre-left media, are all converging on the same line when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and the same view about Farage's comments. So what do you make of that? And what do you make of Andre Mark's statement?
Okay, well, I think the first thing is that it's tempting to overplay one factor over another, and lots of people do that. I do think that eastwards expansion of NATO played a role in the Ukraine conflict and Putin taking the decision to invade, or at least to take the decision that he may as well behave more belligerently because effectively that's what NATO is doing. And if you're somebody who says, well, eastwards expansion of NATO isn't a provocation, let me just ask you this. What do you think America would do if China was like, hey, Mexico, do you want to join like a defense alliance with us? And maybe we can just like put some missiles, somewhere in Guadalajara. And if the answer that you come to when you imagine this counterfactual is that, yeah, man, like Mexico would get fucked up, that sort of tells you a little something about how the judgment might have been made by Russia. But I don't think that that's the only factor that's at play. I do think that a sense of very belligerent Russian nationalism played a powerful role as well. In particular, this idea that there is no Ukraine, that Ukraine, having been the center for medieval Russian culture, that it truly belongs to Russia and is sort of the cradle in some ways of Russian civilization, I think also an incredibly powerful motivating factor in ways that I don't think should be either overplayed so that it obscures the role of eastwards NATO expansion, but also underplayed so that you don't acknowledge it at all. And then I also think that there is a third element here that the West is deeply complicit in, which is when the Soviet Union fell, the West was completely in favor of what were essentially gangsters with access to weaponry and men privatizing Soviet state assets by stealing them, by seizing control of them. The West called that entrepreneurialism and capitalism. Now, this exact model of gangster capitalism was, one, intensely chaotic and traumatic for the Russian people. It led to the reversal of many living standards indicators, including things like life expectancy for a while. And when Putin came in, while that certainly wasn't an end to gangster capitalism, it was an end to the chaotic era of gangster capitalism. There are many Russians who say, well, as long as he never takes us back to that era of the early 90s, I'm going to stick with him. Right. And that period of the early 90s was something that was broadly supported by the West. And Putin, when he came to power, was also broadly supported by the West, including by Tony Blair. Even as recently as 2014, Blair was saying that Putin had to be considered an ally in the fight against Islamism. London has opened itself up, until recently, of course, as being a laundromat for Russian money. We allowed our real estate to be bought up by Russian oligarchs, so that could be a place to stash their cash. Now, the structure of the Russian state is so that these oligarchs all, essentially owe a very personal kind of loyalty to Putin. And there's a sense that their money is his money, should he ever need to call on it. Now, the UK government knew about this and knew that there was something, deeply dirty and corrupt about this kind of financial activity. But we wanted it because it brought the money here. And ironically, people like Jeremy Corbyn, who always took a very, very firm line against that, in the heydays of the 2000s and 2010s, then get smeared as being Putin apologists because they say, well, maybe it's not so realistic to encourage Ukraine to fight to the end, and maybe there is a better and more peaceful settlement that can be achieved. Oh no, you're a Putin apologist. Similarly, you're smeared as a Putin apologist if you say maybe eastwards NATO expansion played a role here, and no one's called a Putin apologist if they spent the 2000s saying, yeah, this guy Vladimir Putin, we can really get on with him. Hey. Your best mate, Roman Abramovich, wasn't he just by Chelsea Football Club? Those people aren't smeared as Putin apologists.
Yeah. I don't trust Farage's motives at all here in taking this line. I'm not convinced that he really believes it. And the track record of leaders of similar right-wing populist parties across Europe is that they start off being skeptical about Ukraine, and then as they seek access to the mainstream, that kind of withers away. So if you look at Meloni or Le Pen, for example. But one thing that I will say that really annoys me is that on this topic, and maybe on others as well, but particularly on this one, it seems like you're not allowed to make a very basic distinction between an explanation and a justification. Like, I can explain to you why I spiked Michael Walker's sandwich with E. coli, but it doesn't justify it. And I think that Farage's point here that, we need to look at what leads to something doesn't mean that we're necessarily justifying the outcome that it led to. It just means that we might, for example, be trying to avoid that outcome in the future, or indeed it might be what sets us on a path to peace where we realize actually the dynamic is this, and attrition isn't going to be the solution, just waiting until one side is completely worn out, rather finding a way to address the tensions that may have played a part in leading to the conflict in the first place is the way to a solution and to peace. All right, let's wrap it up there. We've had a slightly shorter show for you tonight because Michael's off sick. But thank you, Ash, for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for hosting, Stephen. I personally think that this is the new A-team. And if you never let Michael Walker out of that, locked trunk, so much the better.
Let's see, but I'll take it. A-team. I'm very happy with that. Thanks everyone for watching. Make sure to come back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.